This lesson plan will have students reading young adult literature, writing essays, and participating in classroom discussions to understand the ideas of a single story, intersectionality, and social justice. The purpose of this unit is to get high school students to see other people's intersectionality and become socially aware activists in their communities. In Week 1, we will introduce the idea of a single story. Students will be given the definition of the single story and be asked to write down their own single story, the one thing that defines them. They should realize how difficult it is to condense oneself into a single narrative. Students will be asked to share their single stories with each other in small groups. After, the teacher will ask the class to raise their hands if they felt like they gave others a complete image of themselves. They should mostly say no, and they will be instructed to keep their single story to use next week. They will watch Chimamanda Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story TED Talk. Students will be asked to take a couple minutes to think about their own multiple stories. This will only be a short thinking exercise to get students to begin thinking about the next classroom assignment. They will then be assigned to read The Serpent King at home. In Week 2, students will be instructed to take their papers from the previous week and add other stories to their single story so that others can better understand them as a complete person. They will then get into the same small groups to share what their single story was, and then share the other stories about themselves that they want people to know. Students will also be introduced to the concept of intersectionality. They will engage in class-wide discussion on the character's intersectionality in The Serpent King. The teacher will review the United Nations Intersectionality Resource Guide and Toolkit table on what intersectionality is and isn't. Students will be asked to write a 1,000-word essay on how and if the characters in The Serpent King can balance their identities with cultural expectations of them. They will also begin reading the rest of the story by Sarah Dressen. Week 3. Students will be introduced to the idea of compartmentalization of identities. They will learn that individuals sometimes divide their identities and activate different ones in different contexts. Students will be asked to write down when and why individuals might compartmentalize. Students will be asked to break into small groups and discuss why individuals might compartmentalize their identities. Small groups will disband, and the class as a whole will discuss how and why the characters in the rest of the story compartmentalize their identities. Students will be asked to write a 1,000-word essay using Dressen's book. They will be asked to explain how intersectionality and compartmentalization are related, citing quotes and examples from the book. In Week 4, students will begin to interact with ideas regarding diverse and multicultural identities. Students discussing the lives of people whose lived experiences do not match their own will help them see beyond themselves. They will begin reading Darkroom, a memoir in black and white, by Lila Weaver. Students will be asked to take 5 minutes to list what defines a culture. The teacher will then introduce them to Edward Hall's Cultural Iceberg. Students will be asked if they listed any of the items in the deep culture section of the model and to explain why they think that it's important. They will also be asked which items in the deep culture section of the model they would want people to examine as part of a study of their own culture. Students will be asked to write a 1,000-word essay on the deep culture values the protagonist in Darkroom navigated. They will be asked to describe how the deep culture items from her culture conflicted with and aligned with her white and black neighbors' cultures, and offer suggestions for how everyone in the book could have tried to understand each other's cultures more deeply. In Week 5, students will be introduced to social justice and activism. The teacher will begin the module by explaining to students that the topics they will cover are uncomfortable but necessary to discuss. It will be critical for the instructor to pay attention to students' emotional states and mitigate discomfort when necessary. This module will span 2 weeks for adequate coverage of the issues. Students will be asked to take 5 minutes to write what problems existed during the civil rights movement and explain whether they think the problems mentioned in Darkroom from the 1960s have been resolved. They will then be asked to take 5 minutes to list some current events that are similar to the ones from the civil rights movement. Students will break out into small groups and share their thoughts. Students will be encouraged to share their thoughts and opinions with one another constructively. The small groups will disband, and the class will be asked to discuss their thoughts as a whole. Students will begin reading Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Ribay at home. Students will be introduced to 3 news articles pertaining to discrimination. 2 students will be randomly selected to comment on each article, and the rest of the class will respond. The teacher will monitor how the class is feeling during these difficult discussions and remind students that the classroom is a safe place to talk about these things. Students should be allowed to step away for a few minutes if the discussion becomes overwhelming. Students will discuss patron saints of nothing in class and be asked to talk about how the civil rights issues previously discussed in class relate to Ridbay's book. They will be asked to expand their understanding of civil rights issues to persons persecuted according to race, poverty, sexual orientation, etc. Students will be introduced to youth activism groups they might be able to participate in, like Virus Racism, Asian Zine, Resilient Youth, and Project Niche Alert. They will also engage in classroom discussion about the ways they might fight injustice on individual levels in their communities. Students will write a final 2,000-word essay about what they learned about identity and intersectionality, ways they can celebrate diversity, and how they might participate in social activism. Their essay should reveal that they have become more aware of people's multifaceted identities and are more socially aware individuals.